A few days after Daniel and I left the storage facility with the family keepsakes we thought had been lost forever, I finally believed life might slow down. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope there would be a quiet morning. No phone calls from our attorney. No unexpected documents. No forgotten records waiting to be uncovered. Just an ordinary day. I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood wake up. The trees outside were beginning to change with the season. A few children rode their bicycles down the sidewalk. Across the street, my neighbor watered her flower beds exactly as she did every morning. Everything looked wonderfully normal. I remember thinking that perhaps normal was exactly what I needed. Then I heard the mailbox close. The familiar metallic sound carried across the front yard. It was such an ordinary noise. The kind you hardly notice until one day it begins bringing unexpected surprises. I walked slowly to the front door. Most of the mail looked routine. A utility bill. A grocery advertisement. A community newsletter. Then one envelope caught my attention. It carried the logo of a local charitable organization. I smiled to myself. Another fundraising letter. Charities often mailed donation requests that time of year. Thomas and I had supported several community organizations during our marriage. Whenever we could help, we did. Sometimes with money. Sometimes by volunteering. Sometimes simply by attending local events. Receiving another appeal seemed perfectly ordinary. I carried the envelope into the kitchen. Set it beside my coffee. Then opened it without giving it much thought. The smile disappeared almost immediately. The very first sentence stopped me. "Thank you, Margaret Anderson, for your generous donation to our children's support program." I blinked. Then read it again. More slowly. Every word remained exactly the same. I carefully turned the page over. Then back again. Surely there had been some kind of mistake. Perhaps they had confused me with another Margaret Anderson. It wasn't an uncommon name. I checked the mailing address. Mine. I checked the greeting. My full name. Everything matched. Only the donation did not. I quietly sat down at the kitchen table. The coffee beside me slowly grew cold as I continued reading. The letter thanked me for supporting children's educational programs. It described how the contribution would help local families. It expressed appreciation for my generosity. The tone was warm, grateful, personal. There was only one problem. I had never made the donation. Not to this organization. Not to any program connected with it. In fact, I had never even heard of the organization before opening that envelope. I read the letter a third time. Then a fourth. Still hoping I had misunderstood something. Nothing changed. I picked up the phone and called Daniel. When he arrived 20 minutes later, I handed him the letter without saying a word. He read the first paragraph. Then looked at me. "You didn't make this donation?" I answered immediately. "No." "Have you ever worked with this organization?" "No." "Have you ever spoken to anyone there?" Again. "No." Daniel nodded quietly. By now, both of us had learned not to dismiss unusual paperwork too quickly. He continued reading. The letter looked professional. Official. Exactly the kind of acknowledgement someone would expect after making a charitable contribution. Near the bottom of the page, another section caught his attention. "Mom!" He pointed toward a line printed beneath the thank you message. "There's a transaction reference." I leaned closer. There it was. A transaction number. A processing date. The date itself meant nothing to me. I searched my memory anyway. Had I written a check that week? Used a credit card? Made an online payment? Nothing came to mind. Daniel continued reading. Then his expression slowly changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to realize he had noticed something else. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid the letter across the table toward me. "Read the name beneath the transaction." I adjusted my glasses. Then looked where he was pointing. For a moment, the words didn't even make sense. Margaret Anderson Family Foundation. I stared at the page. Then read it again. Exactly the same. Margaret Anderson Family Foundation. I slowly shook my head. I don't understand. Daniel looked at me carefully. Mom, you've never established a charitable foundation? I couldn't help smiling in disbelief. No. Never. Thomas and I had donated quietly whenever we could. We never created an organization. Never established a private foundation. Never discussed doing so. The idea had simply never been part of our lives. Daniel picked up the letter again. His eyes moved carefully over every line. Maybe there's another explanation. Maybe, I answered. But neither of us could think of one. The letter appeared genuine. The transaction number looked legitimate. Nothing about the document suggested it had been sent by mistake. Yet everything described a donation I had never made through an organization I had never created. Daniel rested the letter on the table. Either of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he said quietly, I think we should show this to the attorney. I nodded. There was no hesitation anymore. Months earlier, I might have wondered whether I had simply forgotten something. Now I knew the difference between an uncertain memory and a decision I had never made. I had never established a family foundation. I had never authorized one. And I had certainly never donated through it. As Daniel carefully placed the letter into a folder, I looked once more at the printed name near the bottom of the page. It was my name. Our family's name. Connected to something I had never heard of. Outside, the morning continued exactly as before. Neighbors walked their dogs. Children laughed on the sidewalk. Cars passed quietly down the street. But inside my kitchen, another unexpected document had arrived. Another piece of paper carrying my name. Another decision that appeared to have been made without my knowledge. And for the first time, Daniel and I realized that the questions we were asking were growing beyond family keepsakes, insurance records, and storage units. Somewhere, someone had connected the Anderson family name to a charitable foundation that I had never created. And whatever that meant, we both knew it would become the next chapter in our search for the truth. The morning after I received the unexpected letter, Daniel arrived at my house carrying a notebook instead of questions. Over the past several months, he had developed a new habit. Whenever something unexpected appeared, he stopped trying to explain it. Instead, he started documenting it. The letter from the charity lay on my kitchen table. Next to it sat an envelope, a copy of the transaction number, and the notes our attorney had suggested we keep. Daniel looked at me. Before we assume anything. I smiled faintly. We verify. He nodded. Exactly. It had become the one rule that kept us grounded. No matter how surprising a discovery seemed, we would begin with facts. Daniel picked up the phone. I'm going to call the organization that sent this. I nodded. Put it on speaker. After a few rings, a pleasant voice answered. Good morning. Thank you for calling the Children's Community Outreach Center. How may I help you today? Daniel introduced himself politely. My name is Daniel Anderson. My mother recently received a thank you letter for a charitable donation. We're hoping to verify some information. The employee asked for the reference number printed near the bottom of the letter. Daniel read it carefully. The woman typed for several moments. I've located the record. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with me. So the donation exists? Yes, sir. It does. Her answer came without hesitation. Daniel continued calmly. My mother doesn't recognize this donation. We're simply trying to understand our records. The employee remained patient. I understand. She reviewed the file for another minute before speaking again. Our system shows that this contribution was made through the Margaret Anderson Family Foundation. Hearing those words spoken aloud somehow made them feel even more real. Daniel looked toward me. I slowly shook my head. The employee continued. We've received multiple donations over the years from that foundation. Daniel sat a little straighter. Multiple donations? Yes. She sounded as though she were simply reading from a routine database. There have been several contributions at different times. Nothing in her voice suggested anything unusual. To her, it was simply another donor record. Daniel asked another question. Can you tell us how your organization identifies the foundation? She typed again. Our records list Margaret Anderson as the founder. For a moment, the room became completely silent. Daniel didn't speak. Neither did I. The employee politely waited. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. I'm sorry. Would you repeat that? Certainly. Our donor records identify Margaret Anderson as the founder of the Margaret Anderson Family Foundation. Daniel slowly looked toward me again. My expression answered the question before I spoke. I've never founded a charitable organization. He nodded quietly. Then returned his attention to the call. My mother says she has never established a foundation. The employee responded with professional courtesy. I understand. Unfortunately, I can only discuss the information currently reflected in our donor database. Daniel thanked her. Then asked one more question. Do your records indicate approximately how long you've been receiving donations from this foundation? The employee searched again. It appears the earliest contribution in our system dates back several years. Daniel wrote down the date. His handwriting slowed. Several years. Not one isolated donation. Not one accidental transaction. Several years of activity. He asked whether the organization could provide copies of acknowledgement letters or donation records if requested through the proper process. The employee explained that certain records might be available after appropriate authorization and documentation. Daniel thanked her for her time. Then ended the call. The kitchen remained quiet. The only sound came from the clock on the wall. Tick. 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 Finally, Daniel closed his notebook. Mom. I looked at him. You've never heard the name Margaret Anderson Family Foundation before yesterday? No. Never. You never signed paperwork to create one? No. You never attended meetings? No. You never opened a charitable account? Again. No. Each answer came more easily than the last. Not because I was repeating myself. Because I knew with complete certainty what I had never done. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. For several moments, he simply stared at the charity letter lying between us. Then he quietly said something that stayed with me. This wasn't a one-time mistake. I didn't answer immediately. Because I was thinking the same thing. If the charity's records were accurate, then this foundation had existed for years. It had a name. A history of donations. A founder listed in its records. And somehow, that founder was me. At least on paper. Daniel opened his notebook again. He wrote 3 short lines. Foundation name confirmed. Multiple donations confirmed. Mom denies creating it. He underlined nothing. Added no opinions. Only facts. Then he rested his pen. I think I'm beginning to understand something. I looked at him. He spoke carefully. For a long time, I thought the biggest problem was that important decisions were being made without you knowing. He paused. But this feels different. How? He looked down at the letter once more. If these records are accurate, someone has been using your name for years. The sentence settled quietly between us. Not as an accusation. Not as a conclusion. Simply as an observation based on what we knew so far. A charity had confirmed repeated donations. Their records listed a foundation. Their records identified me as its founder. Yet I had never heard the foundation's name until opening one unexpected letter over breakfast. I looked out the kitchen window. The neighborhood seemed exactly the same as it had the day before. Children walked to school. Neighbors waved to one another. Nothing outside suggested that anything had changed. Yet inside my home, another piece of my life no longer matched my own memory. Daniel carefully placed the letter back into its envelope. Then into the growing folder that had followed us through so many discoveries. Insurance records. Medical files. Storage documents. Family correspondence. And now, A charitable foundation carrying my name. He closed the folder gently. Neither of us knew what the foundation truly was, who had created it, or why my name appeared as its founder. Those answers would have to wait. But one thing had already become impossible to ignore. For years, something had existed under the name Margaret Anderson. And until that letter arrived in my mailbox, I had never known it existed at all. The day after speaking with the charitable organization, our attorney took the next step. As always, he resisted the temptation to fill unanswered questions with speculation. "We're not trying to explain the foundation yet," he told Daniel and me. "First, we need to understand the financial records." That approach had become familiar. Every investigation began the same way. Collect the documents. Build the timeline. Separate facts from assumptions. Only then could anyone begin asking larger questions. The attorney prepared formal requests for the records related to the charitable contributions. He explained that some information would require additional authorization because of privacy regulations, while other records could be requested directly from the organizations involved. "We'll ask for donation histories," he said. "Transaction records, dates, amounts. Anything that helps us understand the flow of money." Daniel nodded. "No guesses. Just the paper trail." The attorney smiled. "Exactly." Several days later, the first group of documents began arriving. They didn't answer every question, but they provided something Daniel had learned to value more than explanations. They provided dates. That afternoon, Daniel spread the records across the conference table in the attorney's office. He didn't arrange them by dollar amount. He arranged them by time. The attorney watched quietly. "You've started thinking like an investigator." Daniel gave a faint smile. "I've learned that timing matters." "It does." One by one, Daniel entered each transaction into a notebook. Donation date. Amount. Reference number. Receiving organization. There was no dramatic reaction. Just careful work. When he finished the first page, he moved to the second. Then the third. After nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair. "These weren't random." The attorney looked up. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed to the dates. "The contributions happened at regular intervals. Not every month. Not on the exact same day. But there was a rhythm. A pattern. Several donations appeared throughout the years, separated by fairly consistent periods of time." The attorney nodded. "So they appear to have been made on an ongoing basis." "That's what the records suggest." Daniel circled several dates, then reached for another folder. Inside were copies of financial correspondence we had already collected during previous episodes of our investigation. Bank records. Account notes. Letters. Administrative documents. He began comparing timelines. Not because he expected every event to be connected. Because experience had taught him to look before deciding. Several minutes passed. Then he quietly stopped writing. "What is it?" I asked. Daniel tapped two different documents. "Look at these dates." The attorney leaned closer. One date reflected a charitable contribution. The other came from an earlier record involving difficulties I had experienced accessing information about one of my financial accounts. Daniel continued searching. A few pages later, he found another similar sequence. Again, a donation appeared during a period when I had experienced unexpected problems involving my own financial records. He didn't say the events caused one another. He didn't say they were necessarily connected. He simply noticed that the timelines overlapped. The attorney looked carefully at the documents. "Interesting." Daniel nodded. "I'm seeing this more than once." He continued comparing dates. The insurance records. The correspondence. The donation history. Again and again, he focused on chronology rather than conclusions. Finally, he turned toward me. "Mom!" I looked at him. "Do you remember making charitable donations in any of these amounts?" He slowly slid the list toward me. I studied each figure carefully. Some were modest. Others were significantly larger. I closed my eyes for a moment, searching my memory. Then I slowly shook my head. No. You don't recognize any of them? I recognize giving, I answered honestly. Your father and I supported causes we cared about. But these specific transactions. I paused. I don't remember making them. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. He wasn't surprised. Over the past year, he had learned that memory alone was rarely enough to answer complicated financial questions. That was why the documents mattered. He returned to his notes. Across the top of a blank page, he wrote, "Donation timeline." Underneath, he listed every confirmed contribution in chronological order. Then, beneath that, he added another heading. Known financial events. Without trying to prove anything, he simply placed the timelines side by side. The attorney watched for several moments before speaking. This is the right approach. Daniel looked up. We still don't know where the funds originated. Correct. We don't yet know how the foundation operated. Correct. And we don't know who completed every transaction. The attorney nodded again. Exactly. Daniel appreciated those reminders. They kept the investigation grounded. There were still many unanswered questions. The existing records showed that donations had been made. They showed dates. They showed amounts. But they did not yet explain the complete path the money had taken. That work remained ahead of us. As the afternoon continued, Daniel reviewed each page one final time. Then he quietly closed the last folder. I thought this would be a simple question. The attorney smiled gently. Few financial histories ever are. Daniel looked once more at the donation timeline. The more carefully he examined it, the more one thing became clear. These contributions did not resemble a single spontaneous act of generosity. The records reflected repeated activity over time. Organized. Documented. Consistent enough to deserve careful examination. He gathered the papers into one neat stack. Then looked toward me. I think we're only beginning to understand this. I nodded. So do I. Outside the attorney's office, the afternoon sun was beginning to set. Inside, the conference table remained covered with carefully organized records. No accusations had been made. No final conclusions had been reached. But with every document Daniel reviewed, one realization became harder to ignore. The movement of money connected to the foundation was more complicated than either of us had imagined. And before anyone could understand why those donations had been made, we first needed to understand exactly where the money had come from. Later that evening, Daniel asked Vanessa if they could sit down and talk again. By now, these conversations had become different from the ones they used to have. He no longer arrived with accusations. He no longer began with conclusions. He came with questions. The charity letter rested inside a folder on the kitchen table. Next to it were copies of the donation records the attorney had obtained so far. Daniel wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply wanted to understand how a charitable foundation carrying his mother's name had become part of their family's story. Vanessa sat across from him with a cup of tea. She noticed the folder immediately. I guess you learned more today. Daniel nodded. We did. He opened the folder and carefully removed the thank you letter. Then he placed it between them. The charity confirmed they received several donations over the years. Vanessa looked down at the letter. She remained calm. She didn't appear surprised by the name printed across the page. Daniel noticed that but said nothing. Instead, he asked quietly, Have you heard of the Margaret Anderson Family Foundation? Vanessa folded her hands together before answering. Yes. Her voice remained soft. I have. Daniel waited. He had learned that silence often encouraged people to explain their thoughts more completely. After a few moments, Vanessa continued. Your mother has always cared about helping other people. Daniel looked at her. You know that's true. She smiled gently. Ever since I joined this family, I've watched her volunteer. I've seen her organize food drives, visit neighbors, support church events, help families who were struggling. Daniel nodded slowly. His mother had always believed that kindness was something you practiced quietly. She rarely spoke about the help she gave. She simply gave it. Vanessa continued. I always admired that about her. The room remained quiet. Then she added, I wanted that spirit to continue. Daniel listened carefully. What do you mean? Vanessa looked at the letter again. I believed your mother's name represented generosity. She chose each word carefully. When people saw her name, they remembered someone who cared. She paused before continuing. I thought using her name would honor everything she believed in. Daniel rested his hands on the table. You thought people would appreciate Mom's generosity? Yes, Vanessa answered. I thought they would be grateful. She looked toward him. I wasn't trying to take anything away from her. I believed I was recognizing the kind of person she has always been. Daniel remained thoughtful. He understood why those words sounded meaningful. His mother really had spent much of her life helping others. She and his father had volunteered together for decades. Meals for families after funerals, holiday food collections, community fundraisers, scholarship events. Acts of kindness had always been part of their marriage. Vanessa spoke again. I never had bad intentions. Her voice was calm. I only wanted to do something good. The sentence settled quietly between them. Daniel didn't argue. He simply allowed the silence to remain for a few seconds. Then he asked another question. When you say you wanted to honor Mom? Vanessa nodded. Did you ever ask whether she wanted her name used that way? For the first time, Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She lowered her eyes for a moment. Daniel waited patiently. Finally, she spoke. I don't remember having that specific conversation. Her voice remained gentle. I believed she would have approved. Daniel nodded once. You believed? Yes. Another pause. Then Daniel quietly asked, But did you know? Vanessa looked at him. Either of them spoke for several moments. The question wasn't complicated. It didn't accuse anyone of anything. It simply separated two very different ideas. Believing someone would agree. Knowing they actually had. Vanessa eventually answered. I thought I understood what your mother valued. Daniel accepted the answer without interrupting. He wrote a short note in his notebook. Then closed it. At that moment, I was sitting quietly nearby, listening to the conversation. I hadn't wanted to interrupt. I wanted to hear every word. Not because I was searching for someone to blame. Because I wanted to understand how my own name had become connected to something I had never created. When the conversation paused, Daniel looked toward me. I smiled gently. Then spoke for the first time. I've always believed in helping other people. Vanessa nodded immediately. I know. I still do. I continued. I hope I always will. I looked down at the charity letter resting on the table. Kindness matters. Generosity matters. Giving matters. Then I slowly lifted my eyes. But there's something else that matters too. Both Daniel and Vanessa listened. No one has the right to speak for another person without asking. The room became completely still. My voice remained calm. There was no anger in it. No bitterness. Only conviction. If someone wants to help in my name. I paused. I hope they ask me first. I smiled sadly. Not because I don't care about helping others. But because my name is part of my life. And decisions made with it should also belong to me. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside, the evening light faded beyond the kitchen window. Daniel quietly reflected on everything he had heard. He wasn't deciding who was right. He wasn't deciding who was wrong. He was noticing something much simpler. Intentions and permission are not the same thing. Someone may sincerely believe they are doing good. Someone may honestly hope to help others. But those good intentions do not automatically answer another important question. Who has the right to make decisions in another person's name? As the conversation ended, no voices had been raised. No accusations had been exchanged. Only one quiet principle remained in the room. Acts of generosity are meaningful. Helping others is admirable. But even the best intentions cannot replace one simple act of respect. Asking first. The next morning, Daniel and I met our attorney again. By now, the conference room felt strangely familiar. The wooden table. The growing collection of folders. The notebooks filled with dates and timelines. Every visit seemed to begin the same way. A new document. A new question. Another piece of a story either of us had expected to uncover. The charity letter rested in the center of the table. Beside it lay the donation records we had received so far. Our attorney looked at both of us before speaking. We've confirmed that organizations recognize the name of the foundation. He paused. But recognition isn't the same as understanding how it was created. Daniel nodded. So our next step is the registration. Exactly. The attorney opened a legal pad and began writing a list. If this foundation was formally established, there should be records. He looked toward me. Organizations don't simply appear. They leave paperwork. That sentence immediately caught Daniel's attention. He leaned forward. What kind of paperwork? The attorney began listing the possibilities one by one. We'll request copies of the registration documents. He wrote the first item. The original filing. Then another. We'll identify who submitted the paperwork. He continued. We'll determine who was listed as the legal representative. Another line appeared on the page. We'll ask what identity verification documents were provided. Daniel quietly took notes. The attorney wasn't finished. And we'll request information showing how the foundation was managed. Daniel looked up. The financial accounts? If those records are available through the appropriate legal process. The attorney nodded. We'll seek information about the accounts associated with the foundation and the administrative records connected to them. He set his pen down. Every legitimate organization creates a paper trail. The room became quiet. Daniel stared at the growing list. Registration documents. Authorized representatives. Identity verification. Administrative records. Financial management. One by one, the questions became more specific. Not emotional. Not personal. Administrative. Verifiable. The attorney continued. We're no longer asking whether the foundation exists. We already know organizations have records referring to it. What we need to understand now is how it came into existence. Daniel nodded slowly. And who completed the process? The attorney smiled slightly. That's part of what we're trying to determine. He immediately added another reminder. Without assuming the answer before we receive the records. Daniel appreciated hearing that. Months earlier, he might have rushed toward conclusions. Now, he understood the importance of waiting for documentation before deciding what the facts supported. The attorney began preparing formal requests. Each one was carefully worded. Professional. Objective. There were no accusations. No suggestions of wrongdoing. Only requests for records. Copies of registration filings. Identification of the filing party. Documentation describing the foundation's legal structure. Records identifying the authorized representative. Copies of any identity verification retained as part of the registration process. Administrative history showing significant changes, if such records existed. Daniel watched quietly. Finally, he asked, why are these records so important? The attorney looked at him thoughtfully. Because organizations may change over time. He folded his hands. But significant administrative actions usually leave documentation. He tapped the legal pad. If this foundation truly exists. He paused. Important steps in its history are likely reflected somewhere in records. Daniel looked down at the folders spread across the table. That sentence reminded him of everything they had discovered during the past year. The insurance records. Hospital files. Storage account documents. Bank correspondence. Every investigation had followed the same pattern. Questions first. Records second. Understanding later. The attorney noticed Daniel's expression. What are you thinking? Daniel smiled faintly. I've been noticing something. The attorney waited. For months, I kept believing the truth depended on remembering conversations. He paused. Now I'm beginning to understand something different. He looked around the room. Important events usually leave evidence somewhere. The attorney nodded. Very often they do. Not always in one place. But administrative actions frequently generate records. Daniel slowly closed one folder before opening another. I spent years asking people what they remembered. He looked toward me. I almost never asked what documents existed. I quietly smiled. Neither of us had. Memory had guided our lives for decades. Now we had learned that memories fade. People remember conversations differently. Dates become uncertain. Small details disappear. But paperwork, when properly preserved, can often answer questions memory cannot. Daniel rested his pen across his notebook. Then wrote a single sentence. The truth usually leaves a trail. He read it once. Not because it sounded profound. Because it summarized everything he had learned. He realized something else. For years, those trails had existed whether he looked for them or not. Insurance files had been stored. Medical records had been maintained. Financial documents had been archived. Registration paperwork had likely been preserved somewhere as well. The difference wasn't that the records suddenly appeared. The difference was that he had finally begun looking for them. The attorney finished organizing the requests into one folder. We'll submit these today. Daniel nodded. Then we wait. Yes. The attorney smiled. Sometimes waiting for verified information is the hardest part. Daniel laughed softly. I believe that. As Daniel gathered the folders before leaving, he looked once more at the charity letter that had started this newest chapter. Only a few days earlier, it had seemed impossible that a foundation carrying his mother's name could exist without her knowledge. Now, the question had become more precise. If the foundation had truly been created, someone had completed paperwork. Someone had submitted records. Someone had identified a legal representative. Someone had left a documentary trail. Daniel closed the final folder. For the first time, he fully understood something that had quietly connected every chapter of this journey. The truth has a remarkable habit of leaving footprints. Not always where people expect. Not always easy to follow. But somewhere. In forms. In files. In signatures. In archived records. The story almost always leaves something behind. The only reason he had missed those trails for so many years was that he had never known to look for them until now. That evening, after Daniel drove home, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't read the news. I didn't look through legal documents or financial records. For the first time in several days, I wanted to spend an evening with memories that hadn't been created inside an attorney's office. I walked into my study and opened the wooden cabinet where I had placed the letters Daniel and I had recovered from the storage unit. The ribbon around them was still the same faded blue ribbon I had tied decades ago. Carefully, I untied the knot. The envelopes were worn along the edges. Some had yellowed with age. Others still carried faint postmarks from places Thomas had traveled when we were young. I smiled before opening the first one. His handwriting greeted me before his words did. Neat. Patient. Thoughtful. Exactly the way he lived. I often think handwriting tells you something about a person. Thomas never rushed through a letter. Every sentence looked as though he believed it deserved care. In many ways, it reflected the way he treated people. He never hurried conversations. He listened before speaking. He believed kindness should never feel rushed. I slowly unfolded one of the pages. The letter had been written long before we were married. Back when our biggest worries involved finding steady jobs and saving enough money to begin a life together. The world felt much simpler then. We owned very little. But we dreamed about building a home where people always felt welcome. As I continued reading, I found a passage I had nearly forgotten. Thomas had written about volunteering at a neighborhood food drive during one Thanksgiving season. He described meeting families who had almost nothing. Children who smiled anyway. Neighbors helping neighbors. Then, near the bottom of the page, I found the sentence that made me stop. If we ever have the chance to help someone, let's do it with our own hearts. I quietly read it again. Then once more. Those words sounded exactly like him. Thomas believed generosity wasn't measured by the size of a donation. It was measured by sincerity. Sometimes helping meant writing a check. Sometimes it meant repairing a neighbor's fence. Sometimes it meant driving someone to a doctor's appointment. Sometimes it simply meant sitting beside a person who didn't want to be alone. To him, kindness had never been about recognition. It had always been about people. I reached for another letter. This one had been written several years later. Daniel was still a little boy then. Thomas had been away for work longer than expected. He wrote about missing home. Missing bedtime stories. Missing family dinners. Near the end of the letter, he mentioned a fundraising event at the church where he was temporarily staying. I smiled as I read his familiar sense of humor. He joked that the pie auction had become surprisingly competitive. Then he wrote something that stayed with me all these years. The best gifts are the ones no one feels the need to announce. I softly laughed. That sentence sounded so much like Thomas. Whenever our church printed lists recognizing major donors, he quietly skipped past those pages. Not because he disliked generosity. Because he believed gratitude belonged to the people receiving help, not to the people giving it. Many times I asked him why he never wanted public recognition. He always answered the same way. If we're helping because we need our names remembered, we're focusing on the wrong thing. I gently folded the letter closed. Outside, evening settled across the neighborhood. The room grew darker, but I didn't turn on another light. The soft glow from the desk lamp felt enough. As I sat there, I thought about the charity letter that had arrived only days earlier. My name, printed beneath words of appreciation. A foundation I had never established. Recognition I had never sought. It made me think again about Thomas. Not about legal documents. Not about investigations. About values. About the quiet principles that shaped our marriage. We had always believed that generosity begins with honesty. One cannot replace the other. Helping people is a beautiful thing. But kindness loses something important when it is separated from truth. I carefully placed both letters back into their envelopes. Then rested my hands on the bundle for a long moment. A peaceful smile crossed my face. Thomas had never cared whether his name appeared on a plaque, a newspaper, a donor list, or a thank you letter. If someone benefited from his kindness, that was enough. Recognition was never the goal. Love was. I quietly whispered into the stillness of the room. You were right. The words were meant for him. Though he had been gone for years, I still found myself speaking to him now and then. Not because I expected an answer. Because some conversations never truly end. I looked once more at the letters before tying the ribbon around them again. Then I said something aloud that surprised even me. If we truly want to do good. I paused. We don't need to borrow someone else's name. The room remained silent. Yet those words felt complete. Because they reflected everything Thomas had spent a lifetime trying to teach our family. Generosity is meaningful. Compassion matters. Helping strangers changes lives. But goodness cannot be separated from respect. Every act of kindness should come from the heart of the person offering it. Not from the identity of someone who never had the opportunity to choose. I carefully returned the letters to the wooden box. As I closed the lid, I realized that no legal document could ever teach me that lesson more clearly than Thomas already had. His life had taught it. His letters preserved it. And now, after everything Daniel and I had discovered over the past months, I understood it more deeply than ever before. People sometimes believe that doing good is enough. Thomas believed something even greater. Do good. Do it honestly. Do it quietly. And let your own heart, not someone else's name, Be the reason it matters. That night, Daniel didn't go to bed when the rest of the house grew quiet. Instead, he carried several folders into his home office and closed the door behind him. The room had slowly changed over the past several months. What had once been an ordinary workspace now looked more like a place where someone patiently assembled the story of a lifetime. His desk was no longer occupied by work projects or business reports. Instead, it held carefully labeled folders. Legal documents, bank records, insurance correspondence, medical files, photographs, letters, notes, timelines. Nothing was stacked carelessly. Everything had a place. Everything had been organized for one reason: to understand. Daniel placed the newest folder on the desk. Across the front, he had written only 2 words. Charity Foundation. He opened it beside the others. Then he stepped back. For a long moment, he simply looked at the table without touching anything. Months earlier, he would have seen unrelated paperwork. Now he saw something different. He reached for the wooden box his mother had entrusted to him. It rested near the corner of the desk. He gently placed it in the center. Around it, he began arranging the files in chronological order. The documents about the changed locks. The missing family photographs. The letters that never reached his mother. The bank statements. The insurance records. The storage unit documents. The charitable foundation records. One by one, they formed a wide circle around the wooden box. Daniel slowly walked around the desk. Looking. Not reading. Simply observing. Each folder told a different story. The insurance policy involved one set of questions. The storage unit involved another. The family photographs. The medical records. The recordings. The charitable donations. None of them described exactly the same situation. Different years. Different organizations. Different types of decisions. Different kinds of paperwork. Yet, as he stood there quietly, something continued to draw his attention. Not the differences. The similarities. He opened the insurance file. His mother's name appeared on the policy. He closed it. Then opened the storage records. Again. Margaret Anderson. He moved to the charitable foundation documents. Once more. Margaret Anderson. The hospital records. Margaret Anderson. The legal correspondence. Margaret Anderson. Every file seemed to begin with the same name. He sat down slowly. His notebook lay open beside him. He picked up his pen. For several minutes he didn't write. Instead, he allowed himself to think. Not about blame. Not about conclusions. About patterns. Finally, he wrote a question across the top of a clean page. What do these stories have in common? He looked around the desk again. The answer did not come immediately. Then he began making a list. The insurance policy. His mother said she had never requested its cancellation. The storage unit. She said she never knew it existed. The emergency contact information. She said she never asked for the change. The charitable foundation. She said she had never created it. Each event involved different documents. Different organizations. Different people. But Daniel noticed something else. In every situation, his mother's name appeared. Yet, she consistently described not knowing about the action reflected in the records. He carefully underlined one sentence in his notebook. Mom's name appears. Then, beneath it, he added another. Mom says she was unaware of the decision. He rested the pen across the page. Neither sentence answered every question. Neither sentence explained how each situation had occurred. But together, they described something he could no longer ignore. He leaned back in his chair. For years, he had believed these discoveries were mostly about missing property. A jewelry collection. Family photographs. Letters. Keepsakes. Insurance paperwork. Now, sitting alone with every folder spread across his desk, he realized the story had become much larger. The most important loss wasn't always the object itself. Sometimes, The deeper loss involved something far less visible: the ability to make decisions about your own life. He looked once more at the Charitable Foundation records. His mother's name had been associated with something she said she had never established. He looked at the insurance documents. Again, decisions appeared in records that she said she had not knowingly made. He closed his eyes for a moment, then quietly whispered to himself, "This isn't only about property." The words settled into the silence. He wasn't speaking about ownership alone. He was thinking about something more personal: identity, responsibility, choice. A person's name carries meaning. It represents more than letters on a page. It represents decisions, promises, authority, the ability to speak for yourself. Daniel slowly opened his notebook again. This time, he wrote a different sentence. The greatest loss may not be the things that disappeared. He paused, then completed the thought. It may be losing the opportunity to decide what happens under your own name. He stared at those words for several moments. They reminded him of something his mother had said only a few days earlier. No one has the right to speak for another person without asking. At the time, he had understood the sentence. Now he felt its full weight. The folders spread across his desk were not simply records of missing possessions or administrative changes. Each one represented a moment when important decisions appeared to have been connected to his mother's name. Whether every decision had been authorized, misunderstood, or processed another way remained a question the investigation was still examining. But Daniel realized something that no longer depended on speculation. His mother's name appeared again and again throughout those records. And each time, she had described learning about the decision only after it had already become part of her life. He carefully closed the final folder, then placed both hands on the wooden box. For a long time, he had believed the investigation was about recovering what had been lost. Now he understood something different. Sometimes the hardest thing to lose is not money, not family heirlooms, not even years of misunderstanding. Sometimes the deepest loss is something people rarely notice until it is gone. The right to make your own choices. The right to speak in your own voice. The right to decide what happens under your own name. As Daniel turned off the desk lamp that night, every folder remained exactly where he had placed it. Different stories. Different years. Different documents. Yet all connected by one quiet question that had become impossible for him to ignore. How many important decisions in his mother's life had carried her name before she ever knew they had been made? 3 days later, our attorney called again. By then, Daniel and I had become familiar with the sound of those phone calls. They never arrived with dramatic announcements. Only quiet words. "I've received another response. I think you should both come in." An hour later, we were seated across from him in the same conference room where so many pieces of our family's story had already been laid across the table. A large envelope rested beside his legal pad. The return address belonged to the agency that maintained the registration records we had requested. Our attorney looked at both of us before speaking. "The records arrived this morning." Daniel nodded. "Are they complete?" "As complete as what was available through this request." He carefully opened the envelope. No one rushed him. Over the past year, we had learned that patience often revealed more than urgency. One by one, he removed the documents. Registration forms. Administrative records. Filing information. Every page appeared orderly and professionally prepared. Daniel leaned forward. The attorney began reviewing the documents exactly as he always did. Starting with the first page. Moving through each section in sequence. No shortcuts. No assumptions. The registration information appeared consistent. Dates. Reference numbers. Administrative filings. Everything looked like the type of paperwork an organization would normally maintain. Daniel quietly made notes as each page was reviewed. "So far," he said, "everything appears to be formally documented." The attorney nodded. "At least on its face." He turned another page. Then another. Neither of us interrupted. The room remained almost silent except for the soft sound of paper moving across the table. Eventually, the attorney reached the final section of the file. He slowed slightly. Not because something immediately appeared wrong. Because final pages often contain operational details that deserve careful attention. He adjusted his glasses and continued reading. Then his eyes settled on one entry. He stopped turning pages. Daniel noticed immediately. "What is it?" The attorney didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully rotated the document so Daniel and I could read it ourselves. "This section identifies the financial account associated with the Foundation's transactions." Daniel looked down. Several lines of banking information appear near the bottom of the page. Routing information. Account details. Administrative references. Nothing unusual in the format. Then his attention settled on the account number itself. He read it once. Then again. A third time. Finally, he slowly shook his head. "I don't recognize this." The attorney looked at him. "Neither do I." Daniel immediately reached for another folder. Inside were copies of the financial records our family had gathered over the past several months. He began comparing account numbers. One by one. His mother's checking account. Savings account. The joint account she and his father once shared. Known family records. Nothing matched. He turned another page. Then another. Still nothing. I watched quietly. I had never memorized bank account numbers. But I knew the institutions where Thomas and I had always banked. This information looked unfamiliar to me. Daniel finally looked up. "It's not Mom's account." "No," the attorney replied calmly. Daniel continued checking his notes. "It isn't associated with any family account we've identified so far." Again, the attorney nodded. "Based on the records currently in front of us, it does not appear to correspond with the accounts we've previously reviewed." Daniel rested both hands on the table. For several moments, no one spoke. The attorney finally broke the silence. "We've identified another financial account." His voice remained measured. "But at this stage, we should avoid drawing conclusions beyond what the records establish." Daniel appreciated the reminder. The documents showed an account connected to the Foundation's registration records. They did not yet explain who controlled it, how it was established, or what relationship it had to anyone involved. Those questions remained unanswered. Still, the discovery mattered. Because it pointed toward another source of information. Another set of records. Another trail that could potentially clarify part of the story. Daniel carefully copied the account information into his notebook. Then closed the file. He looked across the table at me. Either of us smiled. Neither of us looked defeated. We simply understood what this discovery meant. The investigation was not over. Not even close. Our attorney gathered the papers into a single folder. "We'll determine what records can legally be requested next." Daniel nodded. "One step at a time." "Exactly." As we stood to leave, I glanced once more at the final page resting on the table. One unfamiliar account number. Printed in ordinary black ink. So small. So easy to overlook. Yet after everything we had experienced, I had learned that the smallest line on a single document could sometimes lead to the biggest questions. Outside the office, Daniel held the folder quietly against his side. He looked at me before unlocking the car. "It feels like another door just opened." I nodded softly. "Yes. It does." Neither of us knew where that new path would lead. We only knew that another piece of the story had appeared. Another record. Another question. Another place where the search for the truth would continue. And somewhere beyond that unfamiliar account number, another chapter of the Anderson family's story was waiting to be discovered.